All right then. So we're gonna jump right into this one, just like we did last time. I'm your pseudo lecturer for the evening. The first lecture talked about how to create an interesting character using the character diamond, which was about assigning your character four traits that are in opposition or with each other to create an interesting character. So now we're gonna look at specifically how to tell a story in three acts. Before we get into telling a story in three acts, the first question is what exactly is a story at the most basic level? It's something called irreversible change. Essentially, something happens that leads to something else happening, that leads to something else happening. And as you go through each state of change, ideally your characters will go through each stage of change. They can't go back to what they once were. So that is what a story is about. That's what it is, change. And here you have an example of one story, but it's kind of boring. You're just a plant growing. So what you're now looking at then is that you want to tell an interesting story. So that means you are using drama, fiction told in performance. That drama can take any number of forms. It could be something on stage, it could be a book, it could be a TV episode, it could be a movie. But ultimately, drama is what tells that story. And drama takes many forms. As I said, tragedies, comedies, satire plays, action flicks, romantic comedies, name a Hollywood genre, if you will. You have some form of drama taking place right there. Now, if you're going to go back to the history, if you will, hallowed antiquity, you're looking at Aristotle, you're looking at the three act structure. And this diagram here basically breaks down what the three act structure is and how it works. Act one is your introduction and setup. Act two is the rising action that raises the stakes somehow, that culminates in a confrontation, leading to Act three, the crisis, and then things wind down as resolution sets in and everything gets resolved. Now, remember what we discussed about characters, that you wind up with two main ones in any story. One is, of course, your antagonist, your hero, sorry, your protagonist, your hero, and the antagonist, your villain. So the bad guy and the good guy basically have to go at it. And that is what your story is about. That is your irreversible change. And that is what you see in the three act structure. It's the story of your antagonist and your protagonist basically going at it, trying to one up each other, trying to win, trying to push their own agendas, as it were. So I won't go into too much detail here. There is a lot more of this available literally just on Wikipedia. If you want to really deep dive, that gives you quite a lot of information that you can use. But essentially, breaking it down a little bit into a little more detail with act by act, you start with the setup. So you first, in Act 1, you introduce all your players. You will introduce your antagonist, your protagonist. You will probably see some of your supporting characters who have a slightly larger role. You will establish the situation. You will set the scene. I'll talk more about scenes on Saturday evening in the third and final lecture of this series. Is that by establishing the situation, you let the audience get to grips with what's going on, who's who, what's what. Is there a bomb about to go off? Are these a group of soldiers about to go off to war? Are these a group of soldiers about to go on vacation? In a sense, the first act is really exposition that sets up whatever happens next. That happens next is irreversible change, right? I just covered this about the protagonist and the antagonist, right? So this is the pivotal moment at the end of Act 1. You get a plot point. You get that plot twist that changes the entire story. So I used Star Wars in the first lecture, so I'm just going to keep in the same vein to keep it simple and provide some continuity. Episode 4, what is that critical point in Act 1? We get to meet Luke Skywalker, farm boy living with his aunt and uncle. That critical plot point was not finding the droid. was not meeting Obi-Wan Kenobi, but was his murder, well, not his murder, but the murder of his aunt and uncle. That changes everything. That's irreversible change. Even in a movie, well, generally in movies, they dead, they don't come back. There you go.
Unless you're Darth Maul.
Oh, let's not go there. Oh, let's not go there. Oof, I twitch now. Okay, so now you come to Act 2, which is about confrontation. This is where the protagonist and the antagonist are basically going to have to go head to head. They're going to have to go face off. They're going to have to confront, fight, or just basically get in each other's face. This is where you amp up the tension. This is where you get conditional escalation, as it were, or reactionary escalation. The antagonist does something, the protagonist reacts, and then the antagonist reacts to that. Every step is change, is irreversible. So why an antagonist? The antagonist is essentially that catalyst for that irreversible change. He creates conflict in some way. Now, these are the classic bad guy where you're looking at good versus evil. You have Zod, you have Vader, as two great examples of good versus evil. But that irreversible change, that conflict could be, in your typical romantic comedy, two guys fighting over the same girl, right? In one of the more bizarre or outlandish takes on creating an antagonist, you can have, what's a good one? A strange antagonist could be, most of these time travel fics, for example, because it's the lead character who tends to wind up fighting with some aspect of his past self or his future self. Back to the Future does this quite a bit. So that's why you need an antagonist. It is creating that conflict, that irreversible change that drives the story forward. You see? And when you're looking at why they have to conflict with each other, essentially the protagonist is your player, is your reader, is your viewer. You want to see the protagonist win. You feel bad when the protagonist gets hurt. In some cases, you get a little bit worried when he gets his arm blown off or whatever, right? So that's the protagonist. The antagonist is the exact opposite. The antagonist's role is to hurt the protagonist, making you hate him or her. Thus, conflict, irreversible change. Here are some great examples from cinema. This is, of course, from Matrix, the third one, not Reloaded, Revolution, Neo and Smith, right? Other examples, of course, Harry Potter, Voldemort, Venom and Spider-Man, Thor and Loki. Venus, go ahead.
Does Joker consider as antagonist then?
The Joker,
Joker in the latest movie.
do you mean the Joker in the most recent?
The Joaquin Phoenix one.
Yeah, Joaquin
Yes.
Phoenix, thank you. You could consider him an antagonist, but there I'd say he's an antagonist and the protagonist in that he's fighting with himself a lot throughout the movie. He's at war with himself. So it's actually a very good, the movie is a very good character study of a descent into, I suppose, madness in a sense. But yes, you can have a character at war with himself, and by doing so, be both your protagonist and your antagonist. Trust me, doing that it's very difficult to do that. I have attempted it several times and I've given up because I can't keep it straight in my head. Maybe I'll give it another shot sometime and share the results. Now, here is another example of protagonist and antagonist. This is from the first Iron Man movie from the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Best one.
Yep, I still wish I had that Mark 42 armor. Now, if in Act 2 you had the protagonist and the antagonist in conflict, confronting each other, at the end of Act 2, you will get that clutch point. You will get that crisis. You will get that, you will get the lead in, I beg your pardon, to that clutch, that crisis, that big bang event, that is basically going to be the high point of your experience, the crisis. So once you've resolved the crisis, the tension winds down, the loose ends get tied up, and your story ends. So if you've been following along so far with your pseudo homework assignments, you probably have a protagonist of some sort. You probably have an idea for an antagonist. You probably don't have him fleshed out fully yet. That's okay. Because his purpose, remember, is to be the foil of your protagonist. So you need to know what he's about, what he's doing, and why he's doing it. The other details you can fill in as necessary. So, if you're going to create a story following this structure, I think you now have an idea of the key steps and key points along the way. Introduction, setup, creating the world, setting the scene, as it were. Then you have escalation between the protagonist and the antagonist as they confront each other. The stakes get higher. Now, to see movies where you get a really, really good sense of this rising action and the stakes getting higher, you're looking at Christopher Nolan's Batman movies, especially with Bane. That is a case where Bane pushes, Batman is forced to react and keep reacting, and they go back and forth until they finally have their punch up, you know, right at the end of it. And of course, there you have the twist moment at the end and everything. I won't spoil the movie for anyone who hasn't seen it, but that is an excellent example of rising action, of increasing the stakes, of escalation. A movie where there's excellent setup. Ooh, tricky. Okay, a movie with really, really good setup. Most people will agree with me on this, but that will be actually what's it called? Tom Cruise, Emily Blunt, came out 2 years back. Snap. Yeah, a day after, not a day. Edge of Tomorrow, Edge of Tomorrow. Because there, ironically, half the movie is set up. You see him, Tom Cruise's character, get introduced, get himself in trouble, get killed, come back to life, and you see the same introduction, in a sense, over and over again. But you see how the world gets more and more detailed, how the world gets more and more fleshed out, how, as he goes through every iteration, every trip through time, how he literally becomes better, becomes stronger, right? Until he can actually match his antagonist. And if anybody can tell me who the actual antagonist of that movie is, let me know in the chat. People, in my view, people have been getting this one wrong for years.
Alien thingy.
The obvious answer and actually the wrong answer. Everybody goes for the Omega for some reason. All right, and
You're
looking at it,
talking. Are you talking that he's antagonist of himself until he starts growing out from his old characteristic into a new version of
yes,
himself?
yes, that's one interpretation that I agree with. In that he becomes a better person by fighting with himself. He tries to run initially as a coward, and then he realizes he can't run, and then he realizes he can't fight. So he starts copying. He starts learning by making mistakes. And then he finally finds his so-called mentor. And then at the end, he has to go to against his own mentor, Emily Blunt's character. I can't remember her name, but and ultimately winds up working with her. So the growth is there, the action is there, the conflict between antagonist and protagonist is there. The plot twist there is different than many movies and many stories, in that he moves alongside his antagonist. There actually changes as the movie progresses. It starts out as himself, and then it becomes Emily Blunt's character. Sorry, I cannot remember her name for the life of me. For a while, and then the true ultimate antagonist in the film is ultimately, as Venus points out, it's the Omega. But that is literally right at the end of everything. All right.
Is
So
Rita Wartaski?
yes,
Just
Rita
Rita.
Vertasky. That's the name. All right. Okay. So if you're looking at it, that is essentially how you create a story in a three act structure. These are the key points that you need to have, right? Now, what I'm going to do in a second, as soon as my mouse wakes back up, is I'm going to actually show you guys sample three-act structure stories, and these will be available on the Google Drive as soon as I find out where I put them. Okay, here we go. So this one is there's two of them here. A story told in three acts. This one is a tale of revenge. Some of you may recognize this from the game more than the movie because the movie was a total disaster in my opinion. All right, Act One, right? You have the police detective heading home from work. He calls his wife. You know, they're on the way home and everything. And your first major plot twist in that setup is he gets home, his house has been totaled, his wife is lying dead, right, in the living room or something. He gets attacked by the very people that ambushed her. It's a gunfight to the death. You've already established that he's a cop. You've already established that there's some big bad evil guy somewhere that has literally just killed his wife, blown his house apart, and literally just ripped this guy's life to shreds. That is your introduction. That is your setup. Now, Act Two, as an example, few months since the funeral, you know, there's nothing to explain why this happened to him. And then you get your plot twist, that mysterious package. It contains information, something about big corporations, money, experimental drugs, testing on human guinea pigs, right? And then you have the whole investigation thing. He moves to investigate. This corporation reacts by trying to kill him. First, they firebomb his apartment. Then he visits a law office. That place gets blown up next. He tries to interview people. Suddenly, he's involved in running gun battles in the street. It turned the whole city into basically a carnival of carnage, right? So there you have your rising tension, you have your escalation, and in these kinds of plots, very simplistically, it ultimately comes down to, okay, now somebody will spill the beans on where to find the one responsible, to find the antagonist. And then of course, Act 3, culminates in that crisis point, in that one big event, which is the final showdown. He gets his revenge, a lot of people are dead, you wind up all the loose ends. This guy, makes peace. He got his revenge. He makes peace. The classic scene here is, of course, the gravestone. He says, I love you. It's over. I'm done. And he sort of walks into the sunset, a better man, or something along those lines, right? And then as you wind things up, because this is modern storytelling, they always like to leave an option for a sequel. So in this case, I said that, yeah, he got his happy ending, he got his revenge, he rejoins the police force, and strangely got promoted. Because why? The people that sent him the package of information that set everything in motion, they might need him again in the future to take care of other business for them. Now, this is one example of a three-act story. This is a revenge/action plot. Now, for those of you who've been in games, or this game may be older than some of you actually, I just realized, you might recognize the game, you might not. I'll leave you all to figure it out.
Cluedo.
What? Cluedo?
I was thinking Max Payne, but
Yep.
the dollar's not. Is it Max Payne?
It's Max Payne, the first
Yeah, okay.
Max Payne.
Yeah, from the first act.
Well, I wasn't trying to hide it in any great way, right? Okay, so this one is a different example. This is the love story in three acts. Before you ask, yes, I've had to write this kind of thing. Oh gosh. Okay, so Act 1 is invariably boy meets girl. Okay, I'm gonna say this up front. I'm just going with the classic boy meets girl scenario here, And if you want lyrics to go with this one, go look up Avril Lavigne, and you know exactly which song I'm talking about. Hang on, I'm getting a ping in the chat. Do that. Okay, so you all can read, I think, pretty well. what happens here. Boy meets girl. She's one of the popular girls. He's the new kid rather. And the plot twist, there's actually mutual attraction. It's not a one-sided teenage romance thing, right? And he invites her to his house for Thanksgiving dinner. Act 2 is when he arrives, you know, at her place, meets the parents. He meets her parents. That's okay. And then he's not driving anything fancy, but then they wind up back at his house, and it's a freaking mansion. Think Tony Stark on the cliffside mansion. And turns out he's just not the new kid, but he's one of the sons of some billionaire like Bill Gates or something. So this adds your tension. She's the popular girl who was dating the new kid. Suddenly, it's become the case that he's the rich kid slumming it with the popular girl. And so you twist everything around. You give them the change. You give the rising tension, you know? And here, of course, you always have the interfamily drama where his family does not approve of her because she's not good enough for him, you know? So the love story will get complicated as these things do. There'll be fights with the families. There'll be fights with each other. They'll stay together and they'll try to get their love to bloom and to blossom so that they can get their happy ending. Now, I'm evil. So as the writer, just when things seem to be going great, family has accepted, he goes for the annual medical exam and comes back that with a terminal diagnosis of some kind. So this poses your big question, your big bang event, as it were. Can our love survive if one of us dies? Act 3 is obviously he dies. It's a bittersweet ending. She goes on without him, sadder but wiser with the support of his family. So this is another example of a three-act structure and a story told in three acts. You have the same key events that I alluded to in the presentation when, how it should flow from introduction to wind down. Now, most of the time you do this in the space of a single movie or in the space of a single book. If you're writing something longer, like a trilogy or even longer than that, then it's up to you how to structure things in what is essentially going to become a multi-arc story. Now, creating something of that scale, that is that goes into world creation, which is something else entirely. World creation. Okay, I'll segue for just 1 minute on this one here, because when you look at it, right, most of the time the worlds we write in, the worlds we create in, are worlds we create ourselves. That has tremendous potential and can be incredibly terrifying as well, because the world develops however you as the writer want it to develop. Your story, your characters, what they're going through takes place in that world. That world could be as big as one apartment. Friends, for example, that literally takes place in two apartments and a coffee shop. 10 seasons practically. That's where it's at, right? Other things like Game of Thrones, everything that happens in Westeros, everything that goes on for the battle for the Iron Throne, everything. That's like one tiny corner of the entire world map. And we don't know what's happening in the rest of that world at any given time. For those of you with a more sci-fi bent, Warhammer 40K. Just 40K. Forget the Horus Heresy, forget everything else. Just 40K. At any given point in time, there are so many stories going on in that universe, right? That's how world creation works. You have all these stories taking place at once, and that's what creates a very in-depth world, which can be very hard for a single writer to sustain. That's why, for example, with Black Library, the Warhammer 40K, the Horus Heresy series, that is something that involves what they jokingly call the High Lords of Terra. It's the 9 writers that have written the bulk of the books. And considering the Horus Heresy series telling one story, I think has broken book, is going to be about 70 novels when it's finished. And here's the kicker, they've released, it's probably going to be longer because they've actually hit novel number 57, if I remember correctly. And they still haven't arrived at their third act, The Siege of Terra, that has not even begun yet. So that's how you can. That's how large a world and how big a story you can create. I don't recommend starting at that level. All right. Now, I mean, I know that those in the chat here, for the most part, have experience in different aspects of this. Some are fanfic writers. Some have written original fiction, done their own movies. These basic, the three-act structure is a basic, if you will, starting guideline to frame a story, for you to create your story involving the antagonist and protagonist of your choice. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up this lecture slash tutorial for tonight. We've got about 5 minutes left for QA. If we get cut off, I will of course restart the meeting if there are any questions.
3x structure. So any thoughts on other structures and how would that play in?
Okay.
Yeah, are there
Well,
any other forms?
So for example,
there are
just give
many
you,
other forms.
yeah.
Absolutely, there are many other forms. I find that the three-act structure is a very good one to start with, especially for those who have written, who may have written something or who've never written anything at all, because it helps you lay out very clearly what your events are. Now, other forms that are very useful could be the monomyth, which is the or the hero's journey. That one outlines something similar, except that instead of giving you about 9 points to work with, it gives you 13.
Yeah.
All right. It goes into a bit more detail than this structure, but fundamentally covers the same key points. Other ways to tell a story. Some people can do this. I'm not one of them. They can literally just start writing, and they have a narrative flow of their own to tell a story in their own way. You can work up to that, but it takes time. I've been writing for 10 years myself, more than 10 years, and I don't think I'm quite there yet to be able to just write off the cuff and come up with something coherent. Next question from anyone.
Have you written any stories that has a structure of the ensemble cast? You know, last time that we chat about.
Ensemble casts, yeah. Okay, I have ensemble casts can be done. The challenge there is not so much in your character or in your plots. Actually, the challenge is not in your characters. The challenge is in your plot partly and partly in your writing. Because with an ensemble cast, you have to, as the name implies, everybody must be of equal importance. So what you wind up having here generally is ensemble cast. Okay, a good book series for this is Lord of the Rings. The movies also get this across quite well, in that the Fellowship of the Ring is an ensemble. It is a troop. They share a common goal versus a common enemy. And while the Fellowship holds together, it works reasonably well until Boromir does what he does, and everything falls apart. Well, the Fellowship falls apart, you know. And even then, broken up as they are physically by distance in different parts of the world and everything, all of their actions still come together to achieve their key objective, which is the destruction of the One Ring. They achieve it in the end, even though they're not exactly fighting side by side. So yes, it can be done. My best advice for you there is to make sure that you understand your world, you understand your plot, and you be prepared to spend a lot of time in not even writing, in just drafting and outlining things, so that you make sure your ensemble cast everybody gets their fair amount of, well, for lack of a better term, screen time or time on the page. One example I can think of where they didn't do too good a job of this was actually with Arya Stark in Game of Thrones, referring to the TV show specifically here, because literally in season 8 she was almost marginalized until she comes out of nowhere with that one killing blow. Okay, if there are no other questions tonight, then I guess that wraps up this sort of mini lecture right here. Thank you very much for class. I will see you all on Saturday night for the third and final series, lecture in the series, looking at scenes and why you need them. Until then, good night, all.